Alright, so I'm in my master node. We are in KTS master, and we have only, sorry, I should write get nodes. We have only two nodes. One is master and one worker. Now the first thing that I want to discuss is how many namespaces are there. And the command to get namespaces is kubectl get namespaces. So as you can see, we have four namespaces. One is default, the other one is cube node lease, one is cube public, and then we have cube system. These are the four namespaces that we have. So what are these namespaces? The first one is default. Now whenever we create any objects, it can be any object, it can be a pod, it can be deployments, it can be replication controller, or it can be replica set, services, resource quota, so on and so forth. Now, if we do not mention any namespace while creating the object is placed inside of default namespace. And that's what we have been doing so far. We have been creating objects, and all these objects were being created in the default namespace. So I'll show you that. I'll create a pod and I'll show you the namespace of that particular pod. Then we have cube node lease. I think it has been released recently. As of now, it does not have much usage, and also the Kubernetes documentation does not provide any clarity what this namespace does. Then you have kube public namespace, which is number 3 here, and typically you would place any public objects which you want to use or which you want to be used by the public without any authentication should be placed in this namespace. Typically, this namespace is used by cluster resources. We do not work with kube public namespace as such. And the final one, we have kube system. Now this is the namespace that you had seen earlier, the pods for all the Kubernetes components like API server, kube proxy, kubelet, etc. So you might have guessed that this namespace is used by Kubernetes system. All the resources that are created by Kubernetes itself are placed inside of this particular namespace. We have already seen this, but let me show you again. Now it will make more sense. So now if I type Kubernetes get pods, it will tell me there are no resources found in default namespace. So if you do not mention any namespace in the commands, by default, the command picks up default namespace. But how do I see the pods in the kube system namespace? I use the same command, but I append that with -n followed by the name of the namespace. So in this case, the name of the namespace is kube system. And this is the output which you have already seen, and I have already explained you what these pods are. Now these pods are created by the Kubernetes system when it was launched. Similarly, if I type kubectl get pods and -name kube public, so it says that no resources found in kube public namespace, because as of now neither the Kubernetes system nor me have created any pods or any objects inside of kube public namespace. Okay, now I have a file here which is http webpage deployment.yaml, and what I'll do is I'll create a pod out of this deployment file. What this file is, it has a deployment with replicas, with 3 replicas. I use the same deployment file in the previous section also, and it contains a very basic HTTP web page container. What I'll do now is that I will create a deployment using the kubectl create command. So this is the command and the deployment has been created. Now if I type kubectl get deployments, I should be able to see that particular deployment. So it has deployment with replicas. Out of 3 containers, none of them is ready. Okay, now all of them are ready. Similarly, it will be creating a replica set, and this replica set should be having 3 pods. Which namespace these objects have been created in? Let's look at them one by one. The first one is the deployment. Now, if I describe the deployment, it says the namespace. So far you have seen this, but I have been skipping this particular component. So now you know what is this. So meaning that this deployment has been created in the default namespace because we did not provide any namespace whatsoever. So that's why it went to default namespace. And the same would be true for the replica sets and the pods also. Let's take a look at them as well. And this is the replica set, and this replica set has also been created in the default namespace, and of course it is being controlled by the deployment that we have created. And these are the three pods which were created by this particular replica set controller. And let's take a look at one of the pods also. And if I take a look at the pod, of course no surprises there. This pod has also been created in default namespace and is being controlled by the replica set which was created by the deployment. So now you know what this default namespace is and how many namespaces are there by default. Now what we'll do is we'll create our own namespace as per the demo. So you've seen the existing namespaces. The first thing that I want to create, of course we have this Kubernetes cluster with one master and one worker node. First we'll create a namespace dev, and then we'll create a pod in that dev namespace. So let us go ahead and do that. And the name of the pod would be a dev pod. So let us go ahead and create the dev namespace. Of course you can create it from the command line by using create namespace command, and the name of the namespace would be dev. You can create the namespace using a manifest file also, which we'll do in the next case. If I type get namespaces, I should have this additional namespace which is called dev. Now what I'll do is I will create a pod in this dev namespace. So how do you do that? Not pod, rather a deployment. Now here is the file to create the deployment in dev namespace. And you can see that there are two places where I have mentioned the namespace. One is in the metadata of the deployment, and then in the metadata of pod. Let us go ahead and use this and let's see what happens. And let me tell you, this is not a good idea to mention the namespace in the manifest file. I'll tell you why, but let us first go ahead and try to create this. So the deployment has been created. Let's see. Now if I type kubectl get deployments, I should be able to see the deployment in the default namespace. But if I want to get the deployment for dev namespace, I'll have to mention this -n and then dev. So now if you see, we have same namespace two times. And now if I do a describe on this deployment, and here you have to mention the namespace dev also. And if I describe it, now if you see, the namespace is dev. And the same would be true for the replica set, which is this one, and the pods also. Let us go ahead and see those things as well. Remember that you have to mention the namespace here. If you do not mention the namespace, you should get an error saying that there are no resources. And so for that, you have to mention the namespace associated with the object. So in this case, it's this one. So I'll describe it. And as expected, the namespace for this replica set is dev. Same would be the case with the pods also. So the namespace of this pod is also dev. So we were successful in creating this deployment, which is setting in dev namespace. But I told you that we mentioned this namespace here. We mentioned the namespace dev here in multiple places. Now there are two disadvantages of mentioning the namespace in the manifest file. The first problem is that whatever objects you are creating using the manifest file, you have to mention the namespace with all those objects. So here we are creating a pod. This is the pod template. So we have to mention the namespace with the pod object. Replica set is automatically created by deployment. And the same thing had to be done for the deployment object also, meaning that I had to mention namespace in the deployment object. This is one place and this is another place. Now if you have multiple objects in a single manifest file, then I'll have to mention namespaces in all those objects. This is the first disadvantage. And the second one, which is kind of a deal breaker, is that These objects will be created only in the namespace that you mention in the manifest file. So suppose I want to create the same objects in a different namespace. So in that case, I'll not be able to use the manifest file, because in the manifest, if I use the manifest file, I have hard coded the namespaces here. I will not be able to create these objects in any other namespace, which is, you might agree, that is a deal breaker. So we always keep this namespace out from our manifest files. So we mention the namespace separately while creating the object. Having discussed all those things, let's proceed with the remaining portion. So we'll create one more namespace, and the name of the namespace will be prod, and we'll create one more pod named prod pod in prod namespace. Sorry, I did not create the previous pod as dev pod, but that is fine. This time I'll create a pod with the name prod pod. But before that, let us go ahead and create a namespace. I mean the prod namespace. So last time what I did was I created the namespace using the command create namespace. This time I'll create a manifest file. And the manifest file is very simple. The API version is v1, the kind is namespace, and the metadata where we mention the name of the namespace. We'll use this manifest file to create the namespace rather than using the command line. You already know how to do that. So the namespace has been created, and now if you see, we have this additional prod namespace, and I'll go ahead and create the prod pod in this prod namespace. So this is the manifest file for deployment, and this time I'm creating the pods with the name prod pod. But notice that I have not mentioned namespaces anywhere. Now how do we provide the namespace if we do not mention it in the manifest file? That is quite straightforward. You just mention the namespace here using -n command. So what we're saying here is that we'll be creating all the objects inside of the manifest file in the namespace which is provided after the -n option. Press enter, and this deployment has been created in prod namespace. Let us go ahead and see that. First, kubectl get all will give you all the objects in the default namespace. So this deployment is in default namespace, so is this replica set and these pods. If I run this get all command followed by -n-dev, it will show me the exact same objects with different names in this dev namespace. So we have the deployment, replica set, and pods belonging to this dev namespace. And the similar way we can mention the namespace prod, and we'll be seeing the same objects, of course, with different names of replica set and pods in the prod namespace. Now you might be wondering, why do we have the name of the deployments same in all the namespaces? So let me show you. So see, the first one, kubectl get deployment, is getting me the deployment which is in default namespace, and the second one is getting me the deployment for dev namespace, and the third command is getting me the deployment in prod namespace. Now these are the objects that we created, and the name of the objects are same: deployment with replicas, deployment with replicas, deployment with replicas. What I'll do is I'll try to create the same deployment again in the prod namespace, and it should give me error saying that the deployment dash with replicas already exists. But when I created that in different namespaces, it did not give me any error. Why so? So this is where the logical grouping or the logical isolation comes into picture. So one namespace is logically isolated from the other namespace. So that's why Kubernetes did not create any problem when you created the same objects in different namespaces. Now when you're trying to create the same objects in the same namespace, Kubernetes is creating a problem because of obvious reasons. So now you know that namespaces are logical groupings of objects in the same cluster. We did not change the cluster at all. So why would you create, or why would you use multiple namespaces? Because of various reasons. You're catering your applications to multiple customers, you have multiple business lines, you have multiple environments. So there can be various reasons that you can have multiple namespaces and you would like to create multiple namespaces. So the final thing, why, how this dev pod try to connect to the prod pod. So the way it is done is this: you do not mention the name of the pod. You mention the name of the pod, followed by dot, followed by namespace name, then pod cluster local. So this is how you address another object in another namespace. The object name followed by the namespace name followed by the type of object, in this case it is pod, and then cluster.local. We'll go into the details of this naming convention once we discuss services, because it will make more sense if we discuss this naming convention once we cover services. That's all for namespaces. See you in the next video.